Officer James Wilson rubbed his tired eyes as he waited in line at Chicago O'Hare Airport. 3 days of talking, networking, and presenting at a law enforcement conference had left him drained. All he wanted now was to get back home to Atlanta, where his wife and 2 young daughters were waiting. He missed the sound of his girls laughing as they played in the backyard and the comfort of his own bed. The conference had gone well. As a 12-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, James had been invited to share his success stories about community policing. His talk about building trust between officers and neighborhood residents had been well received, with many fellow officers asking for his contact information afterward. "Next, please," called the gate agent, snapping James out of his thoughts. He handed over his boarding pass and ID, then made his way down the jetway. The familiar smell of airplane cabin, a mix of recycled air, cleaning products, and coffee, greeted him as he stepped aboard. Flight attendants smiled professionally as he made his way down the narrow aisle, carefully avoiding bumping other passengers with his small carry-on bag. 14A, 14A, he muttered to himself, scanning the row numbers. James was dressed comfortably for the flight home in jeans and a navy button-down shirt. His police badge was tucked away in his carry-on bag along with his service weapon, properly secured in a lockbox as required by air travel regulations. Today, he was just another tired traveler trying to get home. When he reached row 14, James saw that 2 people were already seated there. An older man with silver hair and kind eyes sat in the middle seat, a book resting in his lap. In the aisle seat sat a woman with platinum blonde hair, pulled back in a tight ponytail. She wore an expensive-looking business suit and was typing furiously on her phone, her red-painted nails clicking against the screen. "Excuse me," James said politely, giving his best public servant smile. "I'm in the window seat." The older gentleman looked up and nodded with a friendly smile, immediately shifting his legs to the side to make room. But the blonde woman didn't even look up from her phone. "Excuse me, ma'am," James tried again, a little louder this time. "I need to get to my seat by the window." The woman finally glanced up, her eyes quickly scanning him from head to toe. Her lips tightened into a thin line as she let out an exaggerated sigh. "Can't you sit somewhere else?" she asked sharply. "This flight is practically empty." James glanced around the nearly full cabin and raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat," he explained calmly. Years of dealing with difficult people during traffic stops and domestic disputes had given him almost endless patience. "Well, I'm not moving," the woman declared, turning her attention back to her phone. "I might need to get up during the flight, and I don't want to keep bothering people." The older man in the middle seat looked uncomfortable, glancing between James and the woman. Other passengers were starting to take notice of the holdup, some turning in their seats to watch the interaction unfold. "Ma'am," James said, his voice still even and professional, "if you prefer an aisle seat, you're already in one. I'm just trying to get to my assigned window seat." "Do you know how much I paid for this flight?" the woman snapped, her voice getting louder. "I'm a platinum member with this airline. I fly every week for business." A flight attendant noticed the commotion and approached. She was a middle-aged woman with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as she assessed the situation. "Is everything all right here?" she asked. "No," the blonde woman said immediately. "This man is trying to make me move, and I was here first." "He's just trying to get to his seat," the older gentleman in the middle interjected quietly. The flight attendant checked the boarding passes. "Ma'am, this gentleman is assigned to 14A, the window seat. You're in 14C, which is the aisle seat you're currently occupying." "Well, I'm not moving my legs for him to crawl over me," the woman insisted, crossing her arms over her chest. "He can find another seat. Look at him, he's too big anyway. He'll take up all the space." James stood in the aisle, aware that he was blocking other passengers from reaching their seats. He kept his expression neutral, though inside he was sighing. He'd faced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said more firmly, "you need to either let this passenger through to his assigned seat, or I can help you find another seat if you prefer. But we need to complete boarding now." The standoff was just beginning, and James had a feeling this was going to be a very long flight home. The blonde woman glared at the flight attendant, then at James, before finally shifting her legs to the side with an exaggerated huff. "Fine, But I'm not happy about this. James nodded politely. Thank you, ma'am. He squeezed past her and the older gentleman, taking care not to bump either of them as he settled into the window seat. He stowed his small bag under the seat in front of him and buckled his seatbelt. The older man gave him an apologetic smile. Sorry about that. Long day of travel for everyone, I guess. James nodded, appreciating the man's attempt to ease the tension. No problem. I'm just glad to be heading home. The blonde woman wasn't done making her feelings known. She pulled out a small bottle of hand sanitizer from her designer purse and ostentatiously squirted a generous amount onto her palms, rubbing them together with exaggerated motions. Then she scooted her body as far away from James as her seat would allow. I can't believe they overbook these flights, she muttered, loud enough for both men to hear. And then they cram us in like sardines. James chose to ignore the comment, taking out his phone to send a quick text to his wife, letting her know he was on the plane. The older gentleman pulled out his book again, clearly trying to create a buffer between the two of them. A different flight attendant came by to check that everyone's seatbelts were fastened before takeoff. When she reached their row, the blonde woman stopped her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Is there any chance I could move to a different seat? Preferably in first class. I'm a platinum member, you know." The flight attendant smiled professionally. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is completely full today. We don't have any open seats anywhere." The woman's face fell into a scowl. "Well, can you at least tell me when drink service will start? I've had a terrible day and need a glass of wine." "We'll begin beverage service shortly after we reach cruising altitude," the flight attendant replied. "About 20 minutes after takeoff." When the flight attendant moved on, the woman turned slightly in her seat, directing her next comments at James, even though she pretended to be speaking to herself. Some people just don't understand customer service anymore. Or maybe it's just that standards have dropped so low these days. They let anyone on planes now. James kept his eyes forward, mentally reminding himself of the techniques he taught new officers for dealing with difficult people. Stay calm, don't take it personally, and don't escalate the situation. The plane began to taxi, and the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their departure and the flight time to Atlanta. As the safety demonstration began, the blonde woman continued her running commentary. "Look at how crowded this flight is," she said to no one in particular. "And they put the biggest people by the window where they can't even fit properly." The older gentleman in the middle seat cleared his throat uncomfortably. "It's a short flight. We'll all be fine." "Speak for yourself," she replied sharply. "Some of us have standards." She turned her head slightly, making it clear she was talking about James without directly addressing him. As the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air, James closed his eyes and tried to focus on thoughts of home. 2 more hours, and he'd be back in Atlanta. 2 more hours of sitting next to this woman who had clearly taken an instant dislike to him for reasons he understood all too well. Once they reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the blonde woman immediately pressed the call button. When a flight attendant arrived, she ordered a glass of white wine, making sure to emphasize that she expected the good brand, not the cheap stuff they usually serve. After getting her wine, she took a long sip and then turned slightly toward James, speaking just loudly enough for him to hear. "So what do you do?" she asked, her tone making it clear she wasn't actually interested in a friendly conversation. "Let me guess, security guard? Or maybe you work in construction." James considered ignoring her, but decided that professional politeness was the better approach. "I work in law enforcement," he said simply. She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You? A police officer? That's funny." She took another sip of her wine. "What department would hire someone like you?" The older gentleman between them looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, perhaps we could all just enjoy a peaceful flight." "I'm just making conversation," she said with false innocence. "I'm curious what kind of police department he works for. Probably more security or something." James took a deep breath. "Atlanta Police Department. 12 years of service." "Right," she said, dragging out the word to indicate her skepticism. "And I'm a brain surgeon. Anyway, if you really are a cop, you must be one of those diversity hires." My brother's friend is a real police officer, and he says they're lowering standards these days just to fill quotas. The older gentleman shifted in his seat. Ma'am, that's really not appropriate. Huh, so you're taking his side now? She snapped. I'm just stating facts. Freedom of speech, ever heard of it? James remained silent, his jaw tightening slightly as he stared out the window at the clouds below. This was going to be the longest 2-hour flight of his life. 20 minutes into the flight, the blonde woman was on her second glass of wine. With each sip, her comments grew louder and more direct. The older gentleman between them had given up on reading his book and was now staring straight ahead, his body stiff with discomfort. So, Atlanta Police Department, huh? She said, turning more fully toward James. Do you even carry a gun? I bet they don't trust you with one. James kept his eyes on the in-flight magazine he'd been flipping through, not giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. He'd dealt with people like her throughout his career, people who couldn't see past the color of his skin to the badge he wore with pride. Hello. I'm talking to you, she said, her voice rising. It's rude to ignore people, you know. The older gentleman shifted in his seat. Ma'am, perhaps he's just trying to rest. I wasn't talking to you, she snapped. Mind your own business. A flight attendant passing by with a beverage cart noticed the tension and paused. Is everything okay here? Before either man could answer, the blonde woman spoke up. Actually, no. I have some concerns about this man. She gestured toward James. He claims to be a police officer, but he won't show any ID. Isn't that suspicious? Aren't there rules about people impersonating law enforcement? The flight attendant looked confused. Ma'am, passengers aren't required to prove their occupation to other passengers. But what if he's dangerous? The woman pressed, her words slightly slurred from the wine. Don't you do any security screening? He could be anybody. Several nearby passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others annoyed, and a few were clearly angry at the woman's behavior. James finally spoke up, his voice calm and measured. Ma'am, I've been trying to respect your space and have a peaceful flight. I'd appreciate it if you would do the same. Oh, now he speaks, the woman said with exaggerated surprise. And he's telling me what to do. Typical. The flight attendant stepped in. Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice. We need to maintain a comfortable environment for all our passengers. I have a right to express my concerns, the woman insisted, becoming more belligerent. This is America, isn't it? Or has that changed too? A passenger from across the aisle, a middle-aged woman with curly hair, leaned forward. Excuse me, but we can all hear you, and your comments are inappropriate. Stay out of this, the blonde woman shut back. Then she turned to the flight attendant. You know what? I want to speak to the captain. This is unacceptable. I'm a platinum member, and I'm being harassed. The flight attendant looked incredulous. Ma'am, from what I can see, you're the one creating a disturbance. Are you calling me a liar? The woman's voice rose even higher. I don't feel safe. This man is intimidating me. James remained silent, his face a careful mask of neutrality, though his hands had tightened slightly on the armrests. The flight attendant glanced at James apologetically before addressing the woman again. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down or what? The woman challenged. You'll throw me off the plane. We're in the air, sweetheart. She smiled smugly. Besides, I'm a paying customer with status. He's probably flying on some discount ticket. Another flight attendant had noticed the commotion and joined her colleague. After a quick, whispered conversation, the second attendant left, presumably to inform the lead flight attendant or the captain. The first flight attendant remained. Ma'am, this is your final warning. If you continue to disrupt the flight, there will be consequences when we land. Consequences? The woman scoffed. For what? Speaking the truth. The older gentleman between them finally had enough. Ma'am, please. Your truth sounds like prejudice to me and everyone else around us. Oh, so you're one of those liberals, she said with disgust. Everything is racism to you people, isn't it? A chime sounded and the captain's voice came over the intercom. This is your captain speaking. I'd like to remind all passengers that disruptive behavior on an aircraft is a federal offense. Our flight attendants are here for your safety and comfort, and we expect all passengers to treat each other with respect. Thank you." The cabin fell silent for a moment. Several passengers looked at the blonde woman, who seemed momentarily subdued by the captain's announcement. The flight attendant used the opportunity to address James. "Sir, would you like to move to another seat? We have one available in the emergency exit row." Before James could answer, the blonde woman interrupted. "Why does he get to move? I'm the one who doesn't feel safe." "Because, ma'am," the flight attendant said firmly, "he's not the one causing a disturbance." The woman's face reddened with anger. "This is discrimination. I want all of your names for my complaint." James considered the flight attendant's offer to move to the emergency exit row. Part of him wanted to stay put. He shouldn't have to be the one to move. But another part, the practical officer who had handled countless volatile situations, knew that removing himself might be the best way to diffuse the tension. "Thank you for the offer," he told the flight attendant, "but I'll stay here. I don't want to cause any more disruption to the flight." The blonde woman let out a dramatic laugh. "Of course you won't move. You want to keep making me uncomfortable. That's probably why you chose the seat next to me in the first place." "Ma'am," the flight attendant said firmly, "seat assignments are made through our booking system. No one chose to sit specifically next to you." "Whatever," the woman muttered, taking another large sip of her wine. She had somehow managed to get a third glass despite the flight attendant's growing concerns about her behavior. For a few minutes, an uneasy quiet settled over their row. James returned to his magazine, and the older gentleman pulled out his book again, though his hands were visibly tense as he held it. The blonde woman typed aggressively on her phone, occasionally making small huffing sounds. Just when it seemed the situation might calm down, she spoke again, this time loud enough for several rows to hear. "You know what the problem is with this country? No one wants to admit it, but I'll say it. We give special treatment to certain people, and then they think they can do whatever they want. They get jobs they're not qualified for, and then they expect everyone to respect them." Several passengers turned in their seats to stare at her. The older gentleman beside her closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for patience. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "please stop. You're making everyone uncomfortable." "I'm just speaking the truth," she insisted, her voice rising. "Everyone's thinking it, but they're too afraid to say it because they'll be called racist." A young woman from the row behind leaned forward. "Actually, we're not all thinking it. Some of us are thinking you should be quiet and let everyone enjoy their flight in peace." "Mind your own business," the blonde woman snapped. James continued to remain silent, his jaw tight, but his expression carefully controlled. Years of dealing with confrontational people had taught him that engaging would only make things worse. The lead flight attendant, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached their row. "Ma'am, I've received several complaints about your behavior. I need you to lower your voice and stop making disruptive comments, or we'll have to take further action." "What kind of action?" the blonde woman challenged. "This is ridiculous. I'm the victim here. No one's listening to my concerns." "Your concerns have been noted," the lead flight attendant replied coolly. "But they don't justify disrupting the entire cabin." "I want to speak to the captain," the woman demanded. "The captain is flying the plane," came the firm response. "And he's authorized me to handle this situation, including arranging for law enforcement to meet us at the gate if necessary." At the mention of law enforcement, James glanced up. The flight attendant caught his eye, and something in her expression suggested she might know about his profession. The blonde woman didn't miss this exchange. "Oh, I see what's happening here. You're all in on it together. What, did he flash some fake badge at you during boarding?" "Ma'am, that's enough," the lead flight attendant warned. "No, it's not enough." The woman was almost shouting now. "I paid good money for this flight, and I'm being treated like a criminal while this man," she gestured wildly at James, "gets treated like royalty. What's he got that I don't have? Oh wait, I know. It's because of all this diversity nonsense." The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet. Even the passengers who had been trying to ignore the situation were now watching with wide eyes. The lead flight attendant leaned closer to the woman. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. One more inappropriate comment, and I will have restraints brought out. Federal air regulations give us the authority to restrain disruptive passengers." "Restraints? Are you threatening me?" The woman's face flushed red. "I want all of your names. I'm going to sue this airline for discrimination. She fumbled with her phone, apparently trying to record the interaction. Everyone watch this. They're threatening a paying customer because I dared to speak up about feeling unsafe. When she pointed her phone toward James, attempting to record him, he finally spoke up. Ma'am, I'd appreciate it if you didn't record me without my permission. I don't need your permission, she shot back. This is a public place. Actually, the lead flight attendant interjected. Our airline policy prohibits recording other passengers without their consent. The woman ignored her, continuing to point her phone at James. Tell the camera who you really are, she demanded. Let everyone see. The tension in the cabin was now palpable. Other passengers watched with a mixture of discomfort and fascination as the situation spiraled further out of control. The blonde woman continued filming with her phone, panning around to capture the faces of nearby passengers and flight attendants. Everyone see this? They're ganging up on me because I expressed concerns about my safety. This is what America has come to. The lead flight attendant stepped partially in front of her camera. Ma'am, I've already told you that recording other passengers without permission is against airline policy. I need you to put your phone away now. Don't tell me what to do, the woman snapped, trying to move her phone around the flight attendant. I know my rights. 2 more flight attendants had appeared, standing in the aisle near their row. One was speaking quietly into a phone, likely communicating with the cockpit. The older gentleman in the middle seat looked utterly miserable. Please, he said to the woman, just stop. You're making this worse for everyone, including yourself. Oh, shut up, you old fool, she spat. You're just as bad as the rest of them. That comment seemed to shock the cabin even more than her previous statements. An audible gasp came from several passengers. A man seated across the aisle stood up. Hey, there's no need for that kind of talk. He's just trying to help. Stay out of this, the woman yelled, swinging her phone to record him too. The lead flight attendant made a decision. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to the back of the aircraft where we can discuss this privately. I'm not going anywhere, the woman declared, gripping her armrests. I paid for this seat, and I'm staying right here. Then I'll need to ask you to surrender your phone and any alcoholic beverages for the remainder of the flight, the flight attendant said firmly. Like hell I will. The woman clutched her phone tighter and downed the rest of her wine in one gulp. This is America, not some communist country where you can just take people's property. The lead flight attendant nodded to her colleagues, and one of them disappeared toward the front of the plane. The tension in the cabin was so thick it felt hard to breathe. James had remained remarkably composed throughout the ordeal, but the woman's increasingly erratic behavior concerned him professionally. He'd seen similar situations escalate to violence, and being in the confined space of an aircraft at 30,000 feet made that prospect especially dangerous. The blonde woman suddenly turned her full attention back to him. This is all your fault, she hissed. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Getting special treatment while a successful white woman gets humiliated. James finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Ma'am, no one is trying to humiliate you. The flight attendants are just doing their job, trying to keep this flight safe and comfortable for everyone. Oh, now you're an expert on their jobs too. She laughed bitterly. What's next? Are you going to tell me you're really an undercover air marshal or something? No, James replied evenly. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a police officer with the Atlanta Police Department. And I'm the Queen of England, she mocked, her words slurring slightly from the alcohol. If you're really a cop, where's your uniform? Where's your badge? Anyone can claim to be anything these days. The flight attendant who had left returned, carrying a small kit. The lead flight attendant took it and addressed the woman again. Ma'am, this is your absolute final warning. Either you calm down immediately and cease this disruptive behavior, or we will be forced to restrain you for the safety of everyone on board. Restrain me? The woman's eyes widened in disbelief. You wouldn't dare. She turned to the other passengers, playing to the audience. You're all witnessing this. They're threatening to tie me up because I don't feel safe sitting next to someone who claims to be a cop but won't show any proof. A flight attendant who hadn't spoken yet leaned toward James and whispered something. He nodded and reached for his carry-on bag under the seat in front of him. The blonde woman noticed this and became even more agitated. What are you doing? What's he getting? Why are you letting him reach for something? he could have a weapon. Her voice had risen to a near shriek, causing a baby several rows ahead to start crying. James slowly and deliberately opened his bag, keeping his movements calm and visible. He reached inside and removed a small leather wallet. The blonde woman stared at it, momentarily confused. What's that supposed to be? James didn't open it yet. Instead, he looked at the lead flight attendant. Ma'am, as a law enforcement officer, I feel I should inform you that this passenger's behavior appears to be escalating to a point where it may pose a safety risk to the flight. Would you like me to identify myself officially? The lead flight attendant nodded. Yes, sir. I think that would be helpful at this point. The blonde woman looked back and forth between them, her expression showing the first hints of uncertainty. What are you talking about? What's going on? James turned to face her directly, his expression professional and serious. Ma'am, before this goes any further, there's something you should know. James opened the leather wallet, revealing a gleaming police badge and his official identification card. The gold badge caught the cabin light, instantly recognizable to everyone watching. I am Officer James Wilson of the Atlanta Police Department, he said clearly, his voice carrying through the now silent cabin. I've been in law enforcement for 12 years and was returning from a conference in Chicago where I presented on community policing strategies. The blonde woman's mouth fell open, her face, flushed with anger moments before, now drained of color. That could be fake, she stammered, but the uncertainty in her voice betrayed that even she didn't believe her words. The lead flight attendant leaned forward to examine the badge, though her calm expression suggested she had suspected the truth all along. Thank you, Officer Wilson. I appreciate your patience throughout this situation. Murmurs spread through the cabin as passengers realized what was happening. The older gentleman in the middle seat shook his head with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. You mean to tell me, the blonde woman said, her voice rising again, that you sat here the whole time, letting me talk, and didn't say anything about being a real cop? I told you my occupation when you asked, James replied evenly. You chose not to believe me. But you didn't show me your badge, she protested. Ma'am, no civilian has the right to demand that an off-duty officer present identification, James explained, his tone professional rather than condescending. I'm a passenger on this flight, just like you. The difference is that my behavior hasn't threatened the safety of this aircraft. The woman's eyes darted around the cabin, suddenly aware of the many disapproving faces watching her. The reality of her situation was sinking in, along with the potential consequences. I didn't know, she said, her voice smaller now. How was I supposed to know you were really a police officer? An older woman from across the aisle spoke up, maybe by not assuming the worst about him from the moment he sat down. The blonde woman glared at her, but said nothing. She seemed unsure how to proceed now that her assumptions had been so publicly disproven. The lead flight attendant addressed James. Officer Wilson, given your professional experience, would you consider this passenger's behavior to be in violation of federal aviation regulations? James nodded solemnly. Yes, ma'am. Interfering with flight crew members in the performance of their duties is a federal offense, as is creating a disturbance that poses a potential risk to flight safety. Her behavior could certainly qualify. That's ridiculous, the blonde woman protested, some of her boldness returning. I was just expressing concerns. You were harassing another passenger based on his race, the lead flight attendant corrected her firmly. You were making discriminatory comments, refusing to comply with crew instructions, and disrupting the entire cabin. We have at least 20 witnesses. The woman's eyes welled with tears, though it was hard to tell if they were genuine or strategic. This isn't fair. I'm being singled out. No, ma'am, James said quietly. You singled me out from the moment I approached this row. I've spent the entire flight being insulted and demeaned by you because of assumptions you made based on my appearance. The blonde woman fell silent, seemingly at a loss for words. The cabin remained quiet as passengers watched the scene unfold. After a moment, the woman tried a different approach. I've had a really terrible day, she said, her voice softer. My business meeting went badly, and I may have had too much to drink. I'm sorry if I offended anyone. The apology might have seemed sincere if not for the way her eyes kept darting to James's badge and the restraint kit still in the flight attendant's hands. The lead flight attendant wasn't swayed. "While we appreciate that, your behavior crossed several lines. The captain has been informed of the situation, and law enforcement will meet the aircraft upon arrival in Atlanta." The remaining 30 minutes of the flight passed in strained silence. The blonde woman kept her eyes fixed on her phone, though she wasn't typing or scrolling anymore. She seemed to be staring blankly at the screen, perhaps contemplating the mess she had created for herself. James returned to his magazine, outwardly calm though his mind was already working through the steps that would follow. As a police officer, he'd been on the other side of this situation many times, meeting planes with disruptive passengers. Now he'd be giving a statement as the victim. The captain's voice came over the intercom as they began their descent into Atlanta. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing in approximately 15 minutes. The local temperature is 78 degrees with partly cloudy skies. I'd like to thank you for your patience during today's flight. We apologize for any disruption to your travel experience." Many passengers exchanged knowing glances. The blonde woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. As the plane taxied to the gate after landing, the lead flight attendant made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate. Also, once we've arrived, we ask that rows 1 through 13 deplane first. All passengers in rows 14 and beyond, please remain seated until further notice. Thank you for your cooperation." The blonde woman's head snapped up. "Why are they keeping us on board?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The older gentleman answered anyway. "I believe they're allowing the authorities to board before we deplane." "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but without the fire she'd shown earlier. She rummaged in her purse, pulled out a compact mirror, and checked her appearance, smoothing her hair and dabbing at her makeup. James remained silent, gathering his belongings and preparing to deplane in an orderly fashion, just as he would on any other flight. When the front half of the plane had emptied, 2 uniformed airport police officers boarded and approached the lead flight attendant. She spoke with them briefly, pointing toward row 14. The officers nodded and made their way down the aisle. "Ma'am," the first officer said when they reached the blonde woman, "we need you to gather your belongings and come with us." "Am I under arrest?" she asked, her voice small and tight. "Right now, we need to get a statement about what happened on this flight," the officer replied professionally. "Please come with us." The woman stood shakily, pulling her designer purse onto her shoulder and retrieving her small suitcase from the overhead bin. The officers waited patiently as she gathered her things, their expressions neutral but firm. As she stepped into the aisle, she glanced back at James. For a moment, their eyes met. There was a flicker of something, perhaps remorse, perhaps just fear of consequences, before she looked away. The officers escorted her toward the front of the plane. As she walked the gauntlet of remaining passengers, she kept her head down, but couldn't escape the disapproving glances and whispered comments that followed her. Once she was off the plane, the second officer returned and approached James. "Officer Wilson, we were informed of your involvement in this incident. We'd appreciate it if you could provide a statement before continuing to your destination." James nodded. "Of course." The remaining passengers were then allowed to deplane. As James walked through the terminal alongside the airport police officer, several passengers from the flight approached to offer words of support. "The way you handled that was amazing," said a young woman who had been sitting a few rows behind. "I don't think I could have stayed so calm." An older man shook his hand. 28 years in the military, and I've never seen such professionalism under fire. You're a credit to your department, son." At the airport police office, James provided his statement while the blonde woman was interviewed in another room. He recounted the events factually, without embellishment or emotion, just as he'd been trained to do. As he finished his statement, the supervising officer shook his head. "Unbelievable." And she kept it up even after the captain's warning. "Yes, sir," James confirmed, even escalated it by attempting to record passengers without consent. "Well, she's being charged with interference with flight crew members and attendants, which is a federal offense," the supervisor explained. "Given the racist nature of her comments, additional charges may apply. The airline is also banning her from future flights." James nodded. This wasn't his first encounter with prejudice, and sadly he knew it wouldn't be his last. but there was some satisfaction in seeing immediate consequences. After completing the paperwork, he was free to go. As he left the airport police office, he saw the blonde woman still inside, mascara streaking her face as the reality of her situation sank in. Their eyes met briefly through the glass partition. This time, she quickly looked away. James stepped outside into the warm Atlanta evening and took a deep breath of familiar air. He pulled out his phone and called his wife. "Hey, honey. Yeah, just landed. Sorry, I'm running late. No, nothing serious. Just had to give a statement to airport police. I'll tell you all about it when I get home. Can't wait to see you and the girls." He smiled as he walked toward the taxi stand. Despite everything, it was good to be home.